components, and this is something that you'll see come up over and over again as we talk today. And then in this case, this also talks through the data flows and the different services, the different Azure components that are being used. Some of the architectures on the reference architecture list even include reference implementations. So for example, this one has a GitHub repository that has a reference implementation of a complete AKS cluster and applications to run on it. So you'll be able to look through this and even get this going yourself if you want to try running AKS and see how it works, and make sure that you can then use this as a starting point for your own application architectures. So the reference architectures are an extremely useful resource, and it's worth just skimming through that anytime you're designing something new to see if Microsoft has already got some information, some best practice architectures that you can start from for your particular purpose. Now, going to a slightly more detailed level, we've then got the cloud design patterns, and these are typically more focused around the specific code or the specific way that you configure services, but these are still really important things to be aware of. We'll be talking a lot about design patterns as we go through today's session, particularly in the Cloud Fundamentals section of today's session, and we'll talk through some of the key patterns when we do that. But you can see here that there's a whole lot of different patterns that are all really there about to try and distill the best practices and some of the common problems that we see customers have, and how we can solve those in a kind of solution agnostic way. So if, for example, you need to have configuration for your application, then the external configuration store pattern is something that we would recommend you look at. And there's a lot of information here to explain why you might consider it, how it would work, and then also some of the pros and cons of these kinds of patterns as well. And in many cases, there's even examples, sometimes with code samples that you can pull as well. Now, if we look beyond just these design patterns, we've also got something in the Architecture Center called the WellArchitected Framework. And this was really the inspiration for today's discussion. The WellArchitected Framework is all about trying to understand how to best design a solution to run on Azure. And we break that across 5 pillars: cost optimization, operational excellence, performance efficiency, reliability, and security. And you'll see on the Architecture Center, there's a whole lot of really useful information in each of these pillars to help you understand how you can make the best use of the well-architected framework and all of the guidance there. This is really a great reference when you're starting to evaluate your own architecture. In the next section, Dan will talk a bit about architecture reviews, and this is a great place to go when you're performing an architecture review, to just think about different aspects of what you can do in your solution to follow best practices on these different pillars. Now, in addition to the well-architected framework on the Architecture Center, there's also a Microsoft Learn path. So this is more of a training course kind of model, and there's modules here. So one that gives you an overall introduction, well-architected framework, and then modules on each of those individual pillars one by one. The material for each of these is very similar. It should really be the same as what's on the Architecture Center's version of the well-architected framework. But the difference here is this is more designed to consume as a training course, as something you would read from front to finish, or front to back. So you can read this material to really get a good idea of how we recommend you think about designing applications and solutions to run on Azure across all these different pillars, and then augment that with the reference version on the Architecture Center if you need to go back and check anything later or to get more detail. And you can even perform an assessment using the well-architected framework. So if you have your own architecture, you can actually use this assessment tool to ask yourself some questions, and that can be a great springboard for a discussion with the Fast Track for Azure team or with anyone else who's doing an architecture review. This is a really good way to help you understand the different areas of your application and where you might need to spend some more time focusing. Now, one layer up from the well-architected framework, we've got the Cloud Adoption Framework. This is really intended for customers who are new to the cloud or new to Azure, to help them understand and to be successful when they're deploying their first workloads, and also when they're generally just planning how they're going to run inside Azure. So there's a lot of information here that's of relevance to not just to technical stakeholders and architects, but also business stakeholders as well. So things around the strategy, why you would move to the cloud and what are the outcomes you're expecting, planning and getting ready to run your first workload inside Azure, the different landing zones that you could consider, the migration paths, and then once you're in Azure, what can you do to innovate and so forth. So there's a lot of really useful material here if you're coming into Azure for the first time, just to help explain what the cloud is, what the cloud does, and what that means for your business, and help you to be successful when you're trying to adopt it within your organization. In addition to all of that material